Okay, it seems it's slowing down. We're at 35, 36 people. So once again, welcome, good evening. Welcome everybody for joining this webinar. My name is Jakob Eifert here at the University of Chicago. Thanks for joining. It's a strange moment to have a talk like this. I guess everybody has many other things on their mind. But it's a good moment. I mean, it's welcome. Certainly, I find it very welcome to have something else, something substantial to think about. That's not the election, but I think it's also appropriate and the right moment to think about politics that are not electoral politics, but politics of the workplace and politics of work that we have to think about, and that is something we will have to think about in this country too. So while people keep coming in, I just want to thank our hosts here. So the event is hosted by CS, the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago. For more information on the center and its event, please look at click the link at the chat. You can also subscribe to our outreach email here in the chat. You can also, I think that's also in the chat function, if you're interested in buying Professor Andreas's book, you can do that through the seminary co-op. So the event is hosted by the center and then co-hosted by the seminary co-op bookstore, thanks to the co-op. So our speaker tonight is Joel Andreas, Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University, known to many of us, I assume, as the author of The Rise of the Red Engineers, the Cultural Revolution and the Origins of Chinese New Class, which is on my list of the top 10 books that anybody who wants to understand the People's Republic of China should read. I hope it's on your list too. I assume it's on most people's list. But he's also the author of a new book that came out last year, and that's what he's going to talk about today: Disenfranchised and Fall of Industrial Citizenship in China. Comments will be provided by Jake Werner, who is Global China Research Fellow at the Global Development Policy Center of Boston University. Jake researches the emergence of great power conflicts between the US and China after the 2008 financial crisis, but has also worked on workplaces in China, the politics, the micropolitics of the Chinese workplace, labor conflicts and everyday life, and has published on labor conflicts and their international dimensions. Professor Andreas has prepared a PowerPoint presentation, slide presentation, and will walk us through the argument of his book for about 45 minutes. And then we will have some 15, 20 minutes of comments by Jake Werner. And then we open up to the Q&A. For the Q&A, please, if you have questions, use the Q&A function, and I will moderate and convey your questions to Professor Andreas. And with that, I think I can hand it over to Professor Andreas.
Okay. Well, thank you. I would certainly like to thank Professor Jakob Eifert for inviting me to talk about my book tonight, and for everybody else who helped organize this event. And for Jake Werner for coming and providing comments and questions, and some tough questions. Let me switch screens here. Okay, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this event on this particular night of very fraught politics in US political history. And taking out the time to hear something about the fraught politics of Chinese history. I'm delighted to talk about my recent book. It's based on Disenfranchised, the Rise and Fall of Industrial Citizenship in China. is based on more than 10 years of research that I had done on the evolution of industrial relations in China over the past 7 decades. So it's a book that covers a lot of history. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions after the end of my presentation and Jake Werner's questions. First, I'd like to put the story that I'm going to tell today in the historical and global context. In a recent class that I was teaching about China, we were discussing the long-term job tenure under the Chinese work unit system, which existed from the 1950s through the 1980s. And a French exchange student piped up and she said, but that was not only true in China, in France during that period. French workers also had lifetime jobs, or many of them did. And that's absolutely true. The decades after the Second World War were what I call the era of the global era of industrial citizenship. This meant that workers in many factories not only had long-term job tenure, and they were also, beyond that, they were considered legitimate stakeholders in the factory. They were also organized, highly organized in many cases, through unions and work councils. Some of these were more autonomous. They were organized by the workers themselves. Others were organized by management or by the state. But whether they were more autonomous or less autonomous, they all provided some kind of venue for participation in workplace affairs. And they considered that the workers were legitimate stakeholders in the factory. During the same period, the slogan of industrial democracy was in vogue. Now, of course, this was never fully realized, but it did mean that workers often had substantial power, reflected the fact that workers had substantial power inside factories and they aspired for more. These ideas, both industrial citizenship and industrial democracy, originated in Europe in the early years of the 20th century, actually dating back to the 19th century. But they were later extended to the developing world, and they encompassed or they reached both workers and capitalists in both capitalist and socialist countries. So this was not simply about the socialist world, it was in many of the capitalist countries as well. Now, since the 1980s, of course, the ideas of industrial citizenship and the practices of industrial citizenship and industrial democracy, to the extent that they existed, have been severely eroded with the rise of neoliberalism and the industrial relations that went along with that, the changes in industrial relations. So my book is about one particular country, it's about China, and it's about the changing industrial relations in China from 1949 to the present. I compare 2 eras. I define these 2 eras as the work unit system era from the 1950s to the 1980s and on into the early 1990s. And then the modern enterprise system, which was established in the mid-1990s and extends to the present. We're continually changing, but these are 2 big eras with very big differences between them. The change that's shifted industrial relations in China from the work unit era to the modern enterprise era was called industrial restructuring. Now, there's been quite a bit of research about what industrial restructuring has meant in China. Most of this research has been about the economic impact. Most of the research that had to do with workers was particularly about the economic impact on workers. My project is a little bit different. It focuses on the political impact. And by that, I mean the changing power relations between workers and managers. With this book, I join a debate, a longstanding debate about the relationship between job tenure and employee dependency and workplace power. And the terms of this debate have long been set by Andy Walder's classical book now, Communist Neo-Traditionalism, which was published in 1986. And he made the following arguments. This is, I think, the central arguments of his book: that permanent employment and the workplace provision of welfare under the work unit system in China led to dependency of the workers on the workplace and on their immediate superiors. And to break this dependence, it was necessary to end permanent job tenure. Other scholars have taken issue with some of Andrew Walder's claims here, arguing in contrast that secure job tenure actually in some ways enhanced workers' power. Among these scholars have been Qingguang Li and Elizabeth Perry and John Unger, Anita Chan and Huayin Li. Now they mainly focused on most of their work. Professor Li is different, but most of them are focused on really the current restructuring era And they treat the work unit era as kind of, they go over it quickly as looking at the structures of the past, but mainly to discuss what happened after restructuring. My book, I go back to the era that Andy Walder was talking about, and I compare the two eras. And actually, I spend most of the book on the earlier period. I spend 6 chapters on the work unit era and only 1 chapter on the industrial restructuring and the post-industrial restructuring situation in factories. So I start the book with a conceptual framework, and this is part of my contribution, I think, to this discussion, which is composed of 2 elements, what I call workplace citizenship and autonomy. By workplace citizenship, I mean this is equivalent to citizenship in a national state, only it's on a workplace level. Under this situation, when workers become citizens, enterprises also become a polity. They become a political entity. And workers become members, and they're considered legitimate stakeholders. Autonomy refers to the right of workers. It can mean lots of different things. For me, it means the right of workers to express opinions and organize collectively, and also to engage in self-management of one type or another on the shop floor. In my understanding, workplace democracy, the actual accomplishment of some kind of workplace democracy, requires both of these, workplace citizenship and autonomy. So I don't consider either of these as an either or situation. They're continuous variables, and they can go from very, very low to very, very high levels of citizenship or autonomy. If you have a high level of workplace citizenship, would mean that workers are full members. They're considered full members in a workplace. They actually have an enforceable claim to their jobs, and they're considered legitimate stakeholders. And on the other end, if they have a low level of citizenship or no citizenship at all, they can be hired and fired at will. Their only relationship is a wage contract, maybe not even a contract. On the other hand, if you have a high level of autonomy in the workplace, you have substantial room for expression, and you have and for collective action and for self-management. And at the other end, if there's little autonomy in the workplace, you have little room for expression or collective action or self-management. Now, these can be combined to produce 4 different, very broad types. The first of which I call market despotism. This is, of course, used by Michael Burawoy and other scholars as a term. And an example might be, this is where workers have very low levels of workplace citizenship and very low levels of autonomy. And it results in a situation where they have very little power in the workplace, and they come and go. Workers just come and go. An example might be a high turnover electronics factory, as many factories are in China. Electronics factories are in China today. High autonomy and low levels of citizenship produce a situation that I call individual autonomy. An example might be engineers in a software firm, where the engineers are highly skilled and highly valued, but they're also highly mobile. They come and go, and they have a lot of autonomy in their own work. But they don't have much citizenship rights in the workplace. They don't stay very long necessarily, and they're not really considered to be recognized as they have some kind of power in the enterprise. A combination of high level of citizenship but a low level of autonomy would result in a situation of paternalism. This is a very common situation along with market despotism. An example would be a company town where workers stay put for a long period of time. They often live there for their whole lives, but they have very little control over what happens in the workplace. And finally, the combination of high level of citizenship and a high level of autonomy produces workplace democracy. An example might be a workers' collective where everybody's a member and they have a vote in the policies of the workplace, et cetera. Another example might be some universities that are more democratic, where faculty have lifetime job tenure, and they're responsible for a lot of their own affairs. They can vote on what their curriculum is, how they're going to teach it, who they're going to teach, and lots of other policies in the workplace. They have a lot of actual power over their individual and their collective inside a faculty department conditions. This would be a type of limited workplace democracy. These are just examples. My research is about China, and it's about factories in China, and I'm looking particularly at radical changes in both workplace autonomy and workplace citizenship over the past 70 years. And China is an excellent place to do this kind of research because both of these factors have changed so much, so dramatically over these past 70 years. My sources are interviews with workers and cadres in over 50 factories in China, as well as factory gazetteers and other documents produced by factories and by industrial departments, etc., as well as newspapers. And these include official newspapers produced by the factories or outside the factories, as well as unofficial publications of the Cultural Revolution factions, workers' factions during the Cultural Revolution. Today, I'm only going to be able to give you a brief synopsis of the central narrative of my book. Of course, I welcome your questions, and I can go into more detail if you want to know about anything more in detail. I'll begin the story with the moment that the Communist Party of China began to take over factories in China in 1948. During this period, the party dispatched a few peasant cadres to take over every factory. Now, the Communist Party was made up of peasant revolutionaries. It had actually very limited connection with workers in factories for the most part, with a few exceptions. So they were sending peasant revolutionaries into these factories, only a handful of them, and they were excellent organizers for the most part, but they did not know much about industry and they didn't know much about urban China. They relied on workers, and they were very hostile to the factory owners, of course, as well as the old regime managers who had worked for the Kuomintang, for the state factories. And they mobilized the workers against these capitalists and the old regime managers. To do this, they built a factory party organization in the factory on the shop floor, composed almost exclusively of workers, very few of the old capitalists or managers. And they also built then to mobilize all of the workers. The factory party organization was a small organization. They recruited a handful of workers. They organized then the union and the Staff and Workers Congress to mobilize the vast numbers of workers, the whole workforce in the factory. And they promoted workers systematically to leadership positions then, replacing the capitalists and the old regime managers. By 1956, they had nationalized all of industry in China, turned it into either state factories or the smaller ones, some of the smaller ones they turned into collective factories, or at least nominally cooperative factory or collective factories. They started, during this period, they built what became known as the work unit system, which existed from this period until through the 1980s. Under the work unit system, workers became work unit members. Their status changed from being hired hands that could be hired and fired at any moment to permanent employees of the workplace. And they had extensive mobility within each unit. There was a lot of vertical mobility within units, especially during the early period, but there was very little mobility among units. Basically, you were stuck in the unit for your entire life for the most part. This system was characterized by very egalitarian distribution relative to other countries, what was going on in most of the world. Everybody lived in an ideal typical work unit. Everybody lived in the work unit. They lived in the same apartments. They rode the same bicycle trails to their workplaces. They ate in the same cafeterias. Their wages were fairly equal, at least relative to other countries. There are many factories that I visited or that have been covered in other research. The veteran worker was the highest paid person in the plant, made more than the party secretary or the factory director or the chief engineer. And they were also characterized, the Chinese Communist Party was intent on establishing what they called democratic management. This wasn't simply a talk. They really meant they wanted workers to participate in management. They had their own very specific ideas of what they meant by it. And I think the two main elements of it, the practical elements of it, was that they wanted workers to participate in self-management on the shop floor. That meant that they organized everybody into small groups. Every member of the small groups had their kind of management responsibilities within their small group. And then the group leaders were often elected by members of the group. And the members of the group would take responsibility for what happened on the shop floor. But they had very little influence above the small group level or above the workshop level. where decisions were made at the factory level or above the factory level, even by the municipality or by the ministry. They simply didn't have any, at least direct influence on decisions made at those levels. And of course, in a centralized economy, many of the decisions made at those levels. The second element of democratic management, which was very important in practical terms, was what they called mass supervision over factory cadres. And that was really my main concern in looking at how these factories operated, industrial relations during this period. The Communist Party was actually, this was a serious slogan as well. It wasn't simply window dress, and they were concerned about controlling their own cadres. They were very concerned about corruption, cadre corruption, abuse of power, alienation, that the cadres had become alienated from the workers or that they were alienated from the workers, what they called commandism or straying from party policies. Now, they had a very strong system of control from above through the party and administrative bureaucracies. But they knew all the time that this was never sufficient. They never considered this sufficient. And so in addition to this, they organized what they call control from below or mass supervision. And what this meant was holding leaders accountable to their subordinates in one way or another. Now, to go back to my central themes or central, principles that I'm looking at in this book, I think that the factories during this period, during the work unit period, were characterized by strong workplace citizenship, but very weak autonomy. They had strong citizenship because of permanent job tenure and because they were considered legitimate stakeholders. On the other hand, the autonomy of workers was very weak. The Communist Party tightly controlled all factory organizations. It stifled in the 1950s a number of union leaders, including the top leaders of the union, wanted to make the unions more autonomous from the party and from the factory leadership, and that was stifled, completely stifled, and they were thrown out. The Communist Party held the Staff and Workers Congress. It regularly met often, but they held it under tight rein, tutelage of the party leadership in the factory. And they suppressed all potential opposition. So this led to a real problem, even for the Communist Party leadership, this lack of autonomy, particularly with regard to mass supervision, because they were serious about mass supervision. And the key problem was, how could workers be expected to supervise factory leaders from whom they lacked autonomy? To solve this problem, they tried to do it in a variety of ways. Most of these involved some kind of mass movement, and there were a series of these movements. The most important of these were the 3 Antis movement and the 5 Antis movement in the early 1950s, the Party Rectification Campaign in 1957, the 4 Cleans movement in the early 1960s, and then the Cultural Revolution, which followed immediately on the tail of the 4 Cleans movement. Now, before 1956, lack of autonomy was not really seen as a big problem. During that period, mass supervision was mainly directed against the capitalists and the old regime managers who they were attempting to displace, who they did displace. And this kind of mass supervision really could be led by the party organization. That was true particularly of the 5 Antis campaign in 1952, when the party sent in work teams to lead workers to criticize the capitalists and their managers. But it was even true of the 3 Antis campaign, in which local party cadres were the main target. Party leaders saw the problems that these local party cadres had, the factory cadres, the factory leaders, was really brought on as a result of corruption by the capitalists and the old regime managers. And they viewed this type of problem could be easily dealt with by dispatching party work teams to mobilize the workers. All this changed after 1956, when the factories were all nationalized or collectivized, and lack of autonomy became much more of a pressing problem. I think each of the subsequent mass movements can be seen as experiments designed to introduce an element of autonomy into these mass movements as part of cadres. But these, I'll go over what that good part of the book is about, is covering each one of these campaigns and then focusing on the Cultural Revolution. Party Rectification Campaign in 1957, Mao encouraged freewheeling criticism of communist cadres from below. Now, the Communist Party had been carrying out mass supervision from the time it was in villages before the revolution in 1949, when it took control of villages. It also organized part of these kind of rectification campaigns and mass supervision of cadres, but they were really all organized by party cadres sent in from the outside. This was the first time in 1957 that Mao really encouraged freewheeling criticism. All of these movements were initiated by Mao, and they were experiments that he was conducting in some ways to try to implement some kind of autonomy or some kind of mass supervision over cadres. In 1957, he really experimented for the first time with encouraging freewheeling criticism of communist cadres from below. Now, most of the work on this has been done about intellectuals in schools and offices in cities. And of course, that's where the movement was centered. But it also was in factories. And I think the idea originally was to extend it to factories once it had been well established in schools and offices. It was carried out in quite a few factories that I investigated. Union leaders took advantage of the movement to press for greater union autonomy and greater autonomy of the staff and workers' congresses. And workers took advantage of the movement to organize protests and strikes, which were largely spontaneous or completely spontaneous. The union took no responsibility for them, just simply tried to mediate them. But this experiment was quickly aborted due to opposition within the party, and it gave way immediately to the anti-rightist campaign from one day to the next. And this was a campaign that was carried out against those that had raised their criticisms during the party rectification campaign. So this was a tremendous, a disastrous consequence for the campaign, and it made citizens reluctant to raise criticism for years to come, the anti-rightist campaign and this disastrous end of the party rectification campaign in 1957. The next major campaign to actually try to implement some kind of mass supervision began in 1962, really took off in 1963. It was called the Four Cleans campaign. It was initially carried out in villages, but then it also was carried out in factories. Most of the work on the campaign, most of the scholarship has been about villages, but actually it was only carried out in a small minority of villages. It was carried out in almost every factory. Virtually every factory that I went to that had been established before 1962. In this movement, Mao went back to the more conventional way that the Communist Party organized mass supervision campaigns, and that is he sent in outside work teams, outside party work teams composed of party officials to try to mobilize the workers inside the factory to criticize factory leaders. During these campaigns, the factory leaders were temporarily set aside, the local leadership, and activist workers were recruited to join a Four Cleans committee. They recruited workers that were considered not to have close ties to the local leadership. And then all workers were mobilized to criticize the factory leaders. And typically these campaigns ended in a new round of factory elections, which they had experimented with in the 50s. And they carried them out more systematically now, where the workers elected their own small group leaders and workshop directors, and even sometimes factory directors. The nature of this movement was that it was tightly controlled from above. Workers participated in the movement. They were all expected to participate. They couldn't not participate, but they all participated under work team leadership. And what this did was it really reinforced top-down authority. The fact that it was tightly controlled from above does not mean that it was mild, quite the opposite. It was quite a fearsome campaign. This is how two basic level employees described it to me. One said a small group leader in an electronics plant told me everyone had to speak up. It was not spontaneous. It was carried out the way movements were supposed to be, following the regular conventions. He's now, for my benefit, comparing this to the favorably, in his view, to the Cultural Revolution. It was very serious. Everyone was very tense, cadres and workers too. It was very fierce, very terrifying. It cleaned up the cadres' problems. I think the Four Cleans movement was the healthiest movement. A slightly or a somewhat quite different point of view was expressed by an ordinary cadre in a steel mill. The leaders, he said, went through a very difficult time. They had to account for their problems over and over again. All the mid-level cadres also had to shower and steep for 3 days or a week. They had to confess and write self-criticism essays. It was very undemocratic, very cruel. Everyone was fearful. Everyone was worried, what have I done wrong? Now, in my view, and I think in the view of most of the literature about this campaign, it was very effective in curbing cadre corruption. On the other hand, it was not as effective at curbing cadres' bureaucratic tendencies. This was isolation from the masses, commandism, controlling, restricting, and repressing. And this was really Mao's main concern. was his second. He made that very clear. And he was not satisfied at all with the movement ultimately. He said in 1965, at the height of the movement, when you develop a mass movement, in the midst of the struggle, the masses are going to do what they want to do, and they'll create their own leaders. In short, you have to rely on the masses. You can't rely on the work teams. The work teams don't understand the situation, or in ignorance, they become bureaucrats and obstruct the movement. By this point, by 1965, even by the time of the Four Cleans campaign, Mao was coming to an increasingly jaundiced view of his own party officials. This can be seen in a statement he made. This was a comment on the progress of the Four Cleans campaign. He said it near the end of 1965, "The class of bureaucrats is sharply opposed to the working class and the poor and lower middle peasants. These leaders who take the capitalist road have become or are becoming capitalists who suck the workers' blood. How can they sufficiently understand the necessity of socialist revolution? They are the targets of the revolution." And then he made this capitalist road as the main target of the movement at that point. In 1966, he then experimented in the midst of the Four Cleans campaign. He experimented with a much more radical method of mass supervision, which became known as the Cultural Revolution. He started it by, actually, he didn't start it with the students and workers forming rebel groups. Once again, it started with work teams, but then he called on the students to throw the work teams out and to form their own rebel groups. And then these rebel groups were autonomous from the local, these were their key characteristics. They were autonomous from the local party organization, and they attacked the local party leaders. Workers in every factory divided into rebel and conservative camps. That was the immediate, or the result over that fall. As soon as workers joined the movement, as soon as workers started organizing these rebel groups, the conservative camp emerged to oppose them. The rebels attacked the party cadres inside the factory, and the conservatives defended them. In my view, the rebels actually became very effective agents of mass supervision in some ways. And they did this, they were able to do this because they were self-organized. The leaders nominated themselves, and they recruited their own followers to form what was called small fighting groups. And then these small fighting groups kind of coalesced, organizing themselves into big coalitions inside the factory. Once again, rebel coalitions and conservative coalitions. They were all led by workers. Now, some of these workers were rank and file party members, but they were not party leaders. There was, on the rebel side at least, there were no party leaders. The conservatives, there were also no party leaders in charge of the conservative groups, but they were supporting the conservative leader, or the leaders, and they were largely inspired by the leadership in the factory. The rebels were not inspired by a particular political program. I think this is a lot of presentations, official presentations of the Cultural Revolution, especially at that time, presented them as if they were inspired by the political program, which became the radical program in the Communist Party. I don't think these rebel groups were inspired by that. What they were inspired by is they did not like the party's tight control over their lives and over their workplace. And they celebrated what became known as rebel spirit. They were particularly fond of Mao's slogan of big democracy, which he brought back into use during this period. He had started in the 1950s. He started talking about big democracy. And what he meant was movements or actual activities that were not formal, normal democracy in any way, but rather riots and rebellions, some kind of unruly activity of the masses to express themselves. Riots, rebellions, and revolutions. The rebels jumped on this, and they saw themselves as protagonists of big democracy. A shift leader in an electronics plant told me, "Before you didn't dare speak because of the cadres. Now you could speak the truth. You didn't have to be concerned about what the leaders thought. They were all capitalist roaders. Their power was gone." A railroad worker told me, "When we called meetings, the leaders didn't dare talk. They were the targets. But the conservatives insisted that the party committee had not made any mistakes. It was a debate among the masses. We debated all the time, when we were working, when we ate, after work." Of course, this did not include the party leaders. Now, this was a self-organized movement in some ways, but it was certainly not spontaneous. The rebels only existed because they responded to Mao's call, and they challenged the party authorities, but they were loyal to Mao. And they had to adhere to Mao's directives. And what those directives were they were supposed to focus exclusively on criticizing the cadres in the factories, and they were supposed to oppose raising economic demands, which of course the workers quite naturally raised. So they had to organize a movement following Mao of opposing economism. This movement has been, I think, correctly called, or has been correctly described as a top and bottom versus the middle movement, with Mao at the top, workers at the bottom, rank and file workers at the bottom versus the Communist Party cadres in the middle. Mao made the extraordinary decision in January 1967 to call on the rebels to seize power in the factories and to seize power in the cities and the provinces as well. From that moment on, the factory party organizations were paralyzed, and the factories fell into the hands of contending factions, these rebel and conservative factions. This led to a much more complicated and increasingly violent factional conflict, because now they were actually fighting for power inside the factories. That had not been true really before this moment. This part of the book is based on case studies of 3 cities, Zhengzhou and Luoyang, as well as Wuhan. I won't go into any of the details of these 3 case studies. Instead, I'll focus on some of the common elements. They were quite distinct, but I'll focus on some of the common elements in the 3 cities, which I think reflect the common elements in all of China in some ways, or at least in a lot of China. The basic thing about seizing power is that Mao, even when he called on the rebels to seize power, he never actually intended for them to take power. He never saw them as a new governing party. Instead, he saw them as temporary agents of mass supervision. And he called instead for, in every factory, the party organization was still paralyzed. He called for the formation of new revolutionary committees, which were supposed to be composed of military officers sent in from above, a handful of military officers, similar in some ways to the initial Communist Party cadres that were sent into factories in 1948, 49. As well as veteran party cadres in the factory, as well, and the third component was mass representatives, which meant rebel leaders of rebel mass organizations. What this actually led to, it was very difficult to form these committees, of course. After they were finally formed in all the factories and all the cities and all the provinces by 1969, the military officers actually took over. They suppressed the rebel organizations and they marginalized the veteran party cadres, and they ruled factories, in some cases with an iron fist, from that time until 1972, when they were finally withdrawn. After the military was withdrawn, this gave rise to a remarkable period of institutionalized factional contention inside factories. This was also a factional struggle. But it was different from the wild factional struggle of the early years of the Cultural Revolution, because this struggle was now brought into the confines of the party. And the party became split into radical and conservative factions. And the conservative factions were really the veteran cadres who were brought back into power. Almost all of them were brought back, and they took charge of the factories, as well as the former rebel leaders who gained positions to supervise these veteran cadres. And that meant they were given cadre positions, sometimes as union leaders, sometimes as militia leaders, sometimes as propaganda, office leaders, et cetera, inside factories. And they were supposed to use and they did, use these positions to then mobilize workers against the veteran party cadres. These factions really extended from the top to the bottom of the party. At the top were, of course, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, and the really representing and mobilizing the veteran party cadres, versus what became known as the Gang of Four. These were relatively not senior officials in the party, not with great power themselves, but dependent on Mao's power. And they mobilized the radicals, the former rebels of the Cultural Revolution, into a faction now inside the party, which I call the radical faction. These factions extended down to the factory floor, and all the way through the entire hierarchy of the party down to the factory floor. Workers who talked about this era talked about them largely as the old cadres and the new cadres. They both had at this point, they had distinct political programs and industrial policies, which I won't go into here. I don't have time to. Those have been discussed in other books. I do discuss it in the book briefly. It also was this period between 73 and 76 was a period of alternating political winds. These were all modulated by Mao. He first supported the radicals, organizing them, mobilizing them to carry out radical movements, and then the conservatives when he figured these movements were going too far. So in 1973 and 1974, the radicals organized the criticized Lin Biao and Confucius movement, in which they took over factories again in many places where they were stronger. Then Mao abruptly called an end to it and brought Deng Xiaoping back to power and supported Deng in organizing a rectification campaign throughout the party, but particularly in factories, because that's where the radicals were particularly powerful. And then the radicals, of course, were dissatisfied with Deng Xiaoping. They appealed to Mao, and Mao encouraged them to organize then what became known as the Beat Back to Right Deviationist Win movement in 1975 and 1976, which became the anti-Deng movement. These factions organized competing mass rallies. Of course, the biggest, the most famous is the rally at Tiananmen Square and other places in China to mourn Zhou Enlai, organized by the conservatives on April 5th, or it was put down, or the last day, or Zhou Enlai's commemoration was on April 5th, 1976. But the radicals also organized their own mass parades and inside factories, mostly outside factories. This entire period of upheaval ended with Mao's death in September 1976. At that point, eventually, let me sum up the Cultural Revolution first. I look at it as a failed experiment in autonomous mass supervision. I divide it into two periods. The first was the rebel movement from 1966 to 1969. I figured the rebels became effective agents of mass supervision. They challenged the party factory leaders, and they permanently undermined their authority. This was into the 1980s and 1990s, they undermined their authority. These organizations were effective because they were autonomous from the party organization, but their autonomy was limited by their dependence on Mao, and because they were only allowed a momentary existence for a couple of years. The second period was this period of institutionalized factional contention from 73 to 76. This was really a period of unprecedented factional contention within the party, but autonomy within this was sharply limited because it took place within the bounds of the party. And this experiment ended with the purge of the radical faction in 1976 and 1977 on into the early 1980s. Deng came to power, of course. Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978. He restored the monocratic party system. That means he eliminated this factional contention completely, eliminated the radical faction, and enhanced the formal, but at the same time, he really enhanced the formal mechanisms of workers' participation, the Staff and Workers' Congress and other mechanisms. This was a period of cautious market reforms, but these market reforms did not touch the main elements of the work unit system, which were public property and permanent job tenure. And because of these conditions, and because Deng had actually enhanced these formal mechanisms of worker participation, workers were staying substantial influence inside factories. In fact, for many workers called it the golden age of the Staff and Workers' Congress system. Staff and Workers' Congresses had a very unstable history during the Mao era. I won't go into this history here. It's a big part of the book. You can ask me questions about it. But the system was, after going through this unstable history, up and down history before 1978, it was revived by Deng in 1978, and it was given substantial formal powers, even more substantial than during the Mao era. But these were powers on paper. Nevertheless, the Staff and Workers' Congress was very active in the early 1980s, and it was they had new experiments at this point with factory elections, where they elected workshop directors and factory directors, et cetera. But the Staff and Workers' Congress, however, always operated under party tutelage. Its autonomy was very limited. Nevertheless, it became an important vehicle for workers' influence inside factories. And they held long meetings, sometimes a week-long meeting, deliberating about housing issues and other welfare issues, which actually these congresses have been restrained from organizing around before, but now were shifted. Their purpose was more shifted from politics under Mao to this welfare issues under Deng. They were severely weakened. And this whole period of workers' influence in the factory was weakened by enterprise reforms in the late 1980s. But the big blow came with industrial restructuring in the 1990s. This began with Deng's famous Southern tour in 1992, when he toured factories, foreign invested factories in Shenzhen and other cities. It really was institutionalized through the company law in 1994 when they started what they called the modern enterprise system, which involved privatizing or restructuring all enterprises in China, those that did not go out of business under this campaign, under the restructuring. And all factories were now to focus on maximizing profits and minimizing labor costs. The three old committees, the Party Committee, the Staff and Workers Congress, and the Union, were replaced by the three new committees. Tells you a little bit about the new era. The three new committees were the Board of Directors, the Board of Supervisors, and the Shareholders Meeting. The restructuring was also institutionalized through the labor law in 1995, which reduced work unit members to contract employees, and it opened the way for massive layoffs, 60 million layoffs in just a few years. This industrial restructuring involved intense battles, intense conflict within industrial China. Staff and Workers Congress were required to convene to authorize what they called employee reallocation plans. And these meetings became venues for substantial resistance against these plans, especially when they involved large layoffs. And it also involved huge street protests and plant occupations, et cetera. I did a case study of, the last chapter is largely a case study of the Brilliant Glass Company. I won't go into the details of that here, but you can ask about it. This resistance continues to this day. This is a photo of steelworkers protesting layoffs in 2016. And it's led to temporary and partial victories, but it simply could not stop the restructuring juggernaut that has very fundamentally changed Chinese industry and industrial relations. In restructured factories today, tens of millions of workers have, of course, already been laid off. It's led to a system of tiered employment composed of a shrinking core of veteran workers waiting to retire and a growing periphery of precarious workers that just come and go. Very different strata of workers in the factories today. And there's vast inequality, of course, between the owners and leaders of the factory, and then the managers of the former managers of the factory become owners of the factory now, and the workers. Vast inequality in terms of everything, wages, but also all kinds of other income that the owners and leaders have. There's also, it's led to much worse conditions in the factories for workers. It's led to very long hours, much more intense labor. Many of the factories I went to, they're now working 7 days a week, a few days off a year. It's also led to much more coercive industrial relations. Small teams no longer meet. Instead, discipline is enforced by fines and threats of discharge. In some factories, the Staff and Workers Congress continues to meet, but it's typically irregular and short and formalistic meetings. And in many factories, there's no Staff and Workers Congress at all. The situation today was captured, I think, particularly poignantly by the comments of two employees in a privatized fiberglass factory. This was part of Brilliant Glass. It had been privatized, taken off from Brilliant Glass and privatized. A veteran worker who'd been there 27 years and now worked in this privatized fiberglass reinforced plastics factory told me that today, who dares say anything? The factory is private. If the boss wants to employ you, he'll keep you. If not, he'll get rid of you. Back then, you could raise issues. To be blunt, now they don't let you speak, they only let you work. Before, there was some room to discuss things. Since enterprise restructuring, now you just work, that's it. His boss, the deputy director of the factory, who was also the union chair, tells you something about the union, and the second largest shareholder. From his point of view, he told me, ordinary workers don't understand anything about the enterprise, especially the contract workers. Their brains don't think about much. They just work and get paid, that's it. Ordinary workers can't express themselves well, they're different from us. We see things from a different perspective. We know the situation better. You can see that the veteran worker would not agree with this statement. They have very different views of what's happened in this factory. So to sum up what the main points of the book, I think the work unit system was never particularly democratic. Nevertheless, workers enjoyed strong workplace citizenship. That meant that they were members of the work unit and they were considered legitimate stakeholders. They had job security. And because of all this, they had substantial influence in the factory, especially on the shop floor. But they had weak autonomy. The union and the Staff and Workers Congress were operated completely under party tutelage, or almost completely under party tutelage. Experiments with autonomy during these mass movements of the Mao era were quickly aborted. And without autonomy, it was impossible to really develop democracy. During the period since industrial restructuring, this industrial citizenship of the past has really been revoked. The workers have been reduced from work unit members to hired hands. This, of course, as Andy Wilder predicted, this has diminished their dependency on the factory, but it's also severely eroded their power inside the factory. What's going to happen in the factory in the future, it's hard to tell. There's certainly large numbers of strikes and protests in China these days. Somewhat less today with repression than there were a few years ago. But nevertheless, there's continuing to be large numbers of strikes and protests in China. Workers may regain a degree of job security, but until they do, they'll be in a weak position to really demand more say in factory affairs. And that's my presentation. I now welcome Jake Werner's comments and all of your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Joel. We will continue with Dr. Werner's comments. So just to let you know, we have time until 6:30. We would like to end punctually at 6:30 Chicago time. That's 7:30 on the East Coast. And maybe in the interest of having some time for questions, those who have questions, please not entering them. And Jake, it's up to you. But if we'll see whether we go straight into questions or leave a bit of time for Professor Andreas to answer your questions. Jake.
Okay. Thank you, Jakob. I want to thank the Center for East Asian Studies as well as Seminary Co-op for the invite and for the chance to discuss this book with Joel. I'm feeling very nostalgic for the in-person Seminary Co-op book events here, and so I'd like to try to at least retain something of the spirit of those, the kind of back and forth and the questions that the discussant would pose to the author. So hopefully this is interesting and useful to everyone. First off, I want to say thank you to Joel for this wonderful book. I really strongly recommend it. It's really well suited to a non-specialist audience without sacrificing the kind of complexity that we academics prize. And so if you are a specialist, I think it will be rewarding for you to read it. But if you are not, it will not be daunting. So I strongly recommend the book. And I think it's very timely. It's a very timely book given what is often imagined as a crisis of the workplace and the economy globally, not just in China, but globally, with the sort of relentless casualization of jobs around the world that often goes under the heading of the emergence of a precariat. So I think it's extremely useful to pose it the way that Joel does here in terms of democracy. It's always been something of a puzzle to me that we in the United States and for many countries around the world, the official ideology is democracy, and yet most people in these countries spend the majority of their lives living and working in explicitly, formally dictatorial institutions. And one of the things the book shows is that there is nothing inevitable about the particular form of despotism in the way that most production is organized today around the world. There are in fact very different possibilities that are worth understanding on their own terms and also worth considering in a critical way as we think about how we want our society to change. So I appreciate the fuel that this book gives, both to thinking about how work is organized in China, but also for people around the world. So the first thing the first sort of question I want to pose relates to this question of democracy. I think it's particularly apt to discuss this topic today in the wake of the US election, which is a very different sort of sense of the word democracy. It's a nationwide election with huge implications, potentially world historical importance. And that's really in contrast to what is under discussion in this book, which is much more the kind of control that people may or may not exercise over the most kind of mundane features of everyday life. I think often we tend not to think these two things together. Very often the academic division of labor separates these questions between different disciplines, between different specializations. We get people talking about national political systems. We get people examining small workplace dynamics. But I think it's more than just sort of a division of labor question. There's also this very deeply ingrained liberal philosophy, classical liberal philosophy, this idea that, you know, we have this the noisy realm of politics where everything takes place on the surface and in full view of everyone. And in that realm, you should have free speech, free association, and the formal participation of everyone in the polity. And then there's another realm, the realm of production, which has, as it were, a sign that says no admittance here except on business. And that, I think, there's a real tension in the philosophy of democracy, both at the popular level and at the kind of ethical, philosophical level. And this is something that Joel points to very diplomatically, I think. This is right at the beginning of chapter 8. He says, conventional accounts portray the reforms carried out by Deng Xiaoping and his successors as transforming China's economic structures while leaving the political structures intact. That is largely true outside of the workplace, but inside the workplace, politics has been completely altered, and completely altered in the direction of despotism. So I think that raises for me an interesting question about what exactly is this connection between very local, very immediate, everyday life, the ability of people to control things that directly affect them, and this big sort of structure of politics that we talk about when we talk about politics, having excluded that first realm from the realm of politics. So this is the first question I want to raise. What exactly is the connection between these two realms? Then I want to pose a couple of other questions that are somewhat related. So what we see in the movement in Joel's book, the movement from a more participatory form of workplace, never truly democratic, but more participatory in the revolutionary era, to the neoliberal era that really excludes worker participation. We see a really sharp contrast there between the work unit system on the one hand, and then the sort of dominance of the market on the other hand. There's a point at which Marx makes about the contrast between these two realms, sort of the contrast between the anarchy of the market, which appears to embody the opposite principle of that represented by the dictatorial factory. And the point he makes is that these appear to be opposites, but in fact, each creates the conditions of possibility for the other. So they're not actually separate principles. They're in fact two complementary aspects of a single system. And I'm wondering if or if not, we can make a similar claim about the more participatory workplaces that we get a very detailed view of in the book. And then the other side of that, which is, of course, is not the market, but the larger overarching structure of the economy is the planning system and the sort of state domination of how the economy coordinates itself and sustains growth. So this is a facet of the question that doesn't come into view very often in the book, and I'm wondering about how Joel would want to think about that. What I'm suggesting is that there may seem to be a contrast between the participatory possibilities of the work unit system and the much more top-down dictatorial planning system that excludes popular participation. What I'm suggesting is that these might be understood well as two complementary aspects of a single system. All right, so that's a second question. A third question. One of the themes in the book that that I think is really important are these extraordinary and rather unexpected parallels in the structure, as this is something that Joel referred to in the presentation. These that in the post-war period, there was a much stronger sense of industrial citizenship, whether you were on the nominally capitalist side of the Cold War, the nominally communist side of the Cold War. There were very interesting parallels in the way that life was lived at an everyday level. And then, of course, we see a similar kind of loss of that concept of industrial democracy in the 70s and particularly in the 80s in both China and in the developed countries. And I think that that point is just important on its own. So often there's this sense in a place like the United States that that the United States had these, wonderful, high-paid unionized jobs, and then the globalization sort of broke up that the security and the stability of that kind of workplace by shipping these jobs to low-wage countries. And this is not to say that China didn't have lower wages, but that there's an important part of that account in most of these narratives, which is that in order for China to become the workshop of the world, the first step was to break apart this very densely interwoven fabric of work units that functioned as very, very small polities in which people had quite a strong sense of belonging and quite a strong sense of the legitimacy of their asserting themselves. And this was a parallel, so that that destruction of the post-war social compact in the realm of labor, that was something that happened on both sides of the Cold War as well. So the question that I want to raise coming out of this, because this is something that my own work upon, and I'm interested, Joel, in getting your thoughts on this, because for the most part you resist the temptation to try to engage that question, the global parallels, and you stay focused on your main topic. So that's I think that's probably wise to not end up writing a 1,000-page book. But I am really interested in your thoughts on what's going on here. Like, why are these two systems that are politically organized in such radically different ways, that have sort of popular and elite self-conceptions that are radically different? Why is it that they seem to be evolving in strongly parallel ways? Let's see. The point in the book where this question strikes me as really interesting is there's sort of a discussion of the often very intense discussions that workers in the factories would conduct about how to distribute compensation, right? Among other things, who deserves a raise and for what reasons. One of the examples here, there's the way that it's posed in the book is that there used to be the ability of workers to talk about who had skills, who was contributing, who deserves a raise. There was an ability for the workers to sort of put a check on the corruption of leadership who might favor their lackeys in the workforce. But something that I found interesting in that discussion was sort of what's going on in the background here is what exactly are the criteria by which people are said to be worthy of having a share of income from the workplace, because ultimately what's considered fair or not, the qualities that are under discussion here are whether the person in question is doing work that is effectively contributing to the expansion of value. So one of the important points that Joel makes is there was this side to the participation system that was fundamentally conservative, because it sort of drew workers into the question of how best to exploit their own labor. And so the question that raises for me is, on the one hand, it seems like the plan is the opposite of the market, or it seems like workplace citizenship is the opposite of the kind of workplace despotism that we're familiar with today. But what I think I want to suggest here is that there might be a deeper kind of continuity across this divide between the revolutionary period and the reform period. Namely, in the earlier period, we saw these characteristics of inclusion and high status and participation for the working class. But all of these things were part of a system that effectively drove growth. And then in the later period, we saw on the surface, it looks like the exact opposite: exclusion, inequality, the absence of participation in the workplace. But this also was the condition of growth. And so the question I want to raise is whether we're dealing with a change that at one level is extremely consequential for the people involved, but that at a deeper level can be analyzed as a form of continuity rather than continuity through a rupture and a reversal, rather than just thinking about these as kind of opposite principles. And then finally, just one quick question. Given all the discussion in the book, I'm wondering, Joel, whether you see possibilities for reforming this system. The impression I came away with was that you're fairly pessimistic, but I'm wondering if you see openings for transforming the extremely hierarchical and unequal system of labor, not just economically, but in terms of status and ability to have a say over our own lives that we see in China today. So thanks again to Joel, and I am looking forward to your responses.
Thank you, Jake. Joel, do you want to respond? We should leave
Sure.
the last 10 minutes we have 2 questions so far, so let's try to keep some time, 10-15 minutes for the Q&A. But yes, if you want to engage, please do.
Yeah, these are fantastic questions, so I do want to respond to them. And I have to thank Professor Werner for the questions. They're really, I really appreciate how deeply you've thought about the main ideas of the book and responded to them. Remind me, what time is the program over?
7:30 on your side.
7:30, yes, 20 minutes now. Boy, I'm just gonna, so we do have some time for question and answer from the audience. I'll answer some of these fairly briefly. The connection between national democracy and workplace democracy. I think I'm glad that you saw that was an important part of the book. I think that during the era of industrial citizenship, they were not so remote. Not only in for instance, wherever unions were strong, unions were connected to political parties. And I'm talking largely about Western Europe, but in other countries as well. And they connected the two. And so there was some connection, and there was an idea that this connection, it always had to fight this liberal idea that factories belonged to the capitalists and there was no room for democracy in factories. But it was actually an idea that was contested then. Of course, in China and other socialist countries, there was also this idea that this democracy at the factory level was supposed to be part of a democratic system, that the Communist Party was supposed to have some kind of mechanisms to respond to the interests and the demands of the masses. And to a certain extent there was, but there was certainly no kind of real open democratic participation at all at the factory level. There was no real mechanisms for it. There was some kind of mechanisms within the party for bringing ideas, trying to get ideas, once again, for the same purpose, to kind of control they did not want the party to be completely autonomous from the masses at the bottom, where there would be a danger of instability in the system. But there was not much democracy above the factory level. So you had two very different systems where there really was, I think, in the factories were more participatory in the socialist side of the world than they were in the capitalist side of the world. And there were more democracy on the national level in terms of political, where political and economics is separated. In the political world, the state world, in the West, in the democratic countries in the West. But the two were probably more connected in the Western European countries, where there was some kind of connection between these parties contesting for power that were related to unions. For certainly in the socialist world, this was really a fraught question. This question of having some kind of collective rights in the workplace, to be members of the workplace, to determine something about how the workplaces were run, but under a system of central planning, which was highly controlled from above, where there was no mechanism for anything except top-down control. There was some autonomy for individual enterprises, but there was not a lot. And especially during the high era of central planning, there was not a lot. I think this was always a tension. The Yugoslavs tried to deal with it in a different way, where they tried to have market instead of less planning and more market, and allow the collectives the factories to be collectives in some sense that they actually operated in this kind of market environment, and were in some ways that allowed more of this factory. The collective membership of the factory would have some ability to decide what they were actually doing as a whole factory. I don't think it was very successful either. And of course, it completely collapsed in the 1980s as well. But this would, anytime you have some kind of central planning, you're going to have to, if you want to have a democracy in the workplace and combine it with some kind of, not simply a market economy, but some kind of central planning in the economy, you're going to have to deal with this tension. It would have to be somehow trying to make the planning more democratic as well. I don't think that's impossible. You have to develop democratic mechanisms to extend beyond the factory. The parallel developments took place in the socialist world and in the capitalist world. I think they're absolutely parallel. That's why I see this. There was this era of industrial citizenship, and then the decline of industrial citizenship in what became the neoliberal era across the world. This was also the end of the socialist systems and their movement towards capitalist market organized economy. Why did they both take place? I think there were crises. This system of industrial citizenship and the power of the workers on both sides in some ways led to a crisis on both sides, because on the capitalist side, there was a profit crisis where the actual power of the workers constrained the profits of the capitalists, and there was a response to that, and this caused problems. And that was where the neoliberal era, that was a lot of the impulse for doing neoliberal reforms in the late 70s and on into the 80s, and then with the much more intensity in the 1990s. On the communist side, I think there was in some ways the same kind of crisis, where they also shifted and to limit the extent of influence of workers in the factories. This developed somewhat independently, but they also began to be more open to the world economy at the same time. And then they were competing, and they were competing against capitalist enterprises. And that kind of set the whole system that they had to operate in, and then they had to move radically to make their enterprises competitive. And they made them super competitive, of course, by moving to a migrant labor force and lowering the power of the workers and lowering the wages of the workers, the compensation of the workers. And in order to, the Chinese model to attract foreign investment, attract Jacob's telling me that we have good questions in the queue, so I should conclude. Check on how you decide wages in the workplace. And this whole question of accumulation. You're absolutely right, there's continuity here. On both sides, it's not continuity, it's on both sides of the divide in the capitalist world and in the socialist world. The socialist world not very bad. In terms of putting money in the hands of capital, and then them making decisions based exclusively on the interests of their interests as private owners and their interests of their enterprise. But this accumulation system in China, as well as another system of accumulation, they were trying to rapidly industrialize. And so they were really trying to accumulate as much capital as possible to reinvest so they industrialize as rapidly as possible. That meant there was not a lot spent on welfare and compensation for workers. There was not a lot spent on housing, other welfare issues. That was a real reality. This was partly due to that these were backwards countries that did not have that when they were trying to industrialize, especially and so they were trying to rapidly to catch up with the capitalist economies. They were trying to industrialize extremely rapidly, and for that reason, they had to accumulate. What that meant is that there really wasn't much room for workers could decide on welfare issues, but there wasn't much room. There wasn't much in the budget for welfare, and they didn't have any control of it. In the 1980s, they had a little more control, and that's when the Communist Party took a somewhat different approach, and they did not accumulate as intensively as during Mao era. And they left a little more in each enterprise, and the enterprise was compelled by the workers then to spend it on housing and other welfare issues. But I think that did in some ways lead to this crisis in the 1990s when they began to compete. Do I think there's much of a possibility for reform? No, not under the current system. I think it's really organized to maximize profits now. And I'm not very hopeful. When I talk to people in China, of course, there are big discussions with them about this, but I don't think this system under the current Communist Party of China is going to move back to anything more democratic inside factories.
Thank you. We have questions from Gail Hershetta, Charles Hayford, Saul Thomas, and Vera Murthy. So let me begin with Gail's question, Professor Hershetta's questions, which is a short one. How would you add the extensive use of contract workers in the Mao years to this account?
Mm-hmm. You know, there were contract workers during the Mao years, but it was very limited use of contract workers. Compared with what we see before 1949 or after the working unit system, after the working unit system was dissolved, there was really a small portion of factory workers, but contract workers. The general, I guess, ideology was that this was not right, that there was something wrong, fundamentally wrong with this, and that laid a basis for workers and contract workers, regular workers and contract workers, to always resist this. During the Cultural Revolution, they made demands to do away with the system altogether. In 1970, they actually did, with a few exceptions, and they reduced the number of contract workers to what they considered a bare minimum. They came back then as they slowly, as they opened these factories in counties where they didn't have any budget. That was, I think they were illegitimate during the whole period, and it was very limited. And for the most part, in many factories, especially during the 1970s, they had more or less equal wages and benefits. They just did not have the job guarantees. But they were expected to become permanent workers. Then during the 1980s, they were also illegitimate, but this was one of the big reforms then of the late 1980s and moving into the 1990s. And of course, nobody has permanent job rights today.
Okay, thank you. Next question is Charles Hayford. How does this system compare to systems in Taiwan, Hong Kong, or even Japan?
All these are old friends that I haven't seen for forever. Charles Hayford, I took China, the first classes I took about China at the University of Illinois at Chicago, many, many years ago. Hello, Charles. How does it compare to other systems in East Asia? I think that these systems were I imagine you're talking about during the era of industrial citizenship, during the post-war eras. And of course, workers in Japan, many workers had permanent job tenure, and they were expected to participate, have shop floor self-management, et cetera, very similar to China. In the 80s, and there was a lot of parallels that people saw on both sides. In Taiwan, I think the same. It was very similar in some ways. This, I think, less so in Hong Kong or in South Korea, actually. I think in those two countries, in Taiwan and Japan, they did have the system of industrial citizenship during that period in those factories as well. to one extent or another. They did not have these same kind of upheavals that they did in China, where they were really contesting over power on the factory floor.
Okay, next question is,
Although in Japan, they had to suppress the unions in the 50s and early 60s in order to accomplish that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jakob.
yes, so we have a question from Saul Thomas, which is longish. I'll try to maybe compress it a little bit. It seems as though there was a strong social basis for the two different factions within the factories during the Cultural Revolution. But it also seems as though the social power of the rebel faction was simply not strong enough relative to the party and army to keep expanding their power. Could you comment on the why? Why were the rebels not able to do that? Were they surprised by Mao more or less turning against them? Did any of the workers, or do you think that they could have done more to expand their autonomy, even in the face of resistance? And then there's a second question. Could you comment on the relationship between the rebel and conservative factions within the factories, and then the same factions outside the factories, so student factions or other factions, how they linked up and drew support from outside factions?
I think the rebels recognized that they were completely dependent on Mao. They did not, compared to this was a powerful party organization. It ran everything in the factory before 1966. Nobody expected there to be able to really be a challenge to these party authorities in the factory. And it was only possible because Mao encouraged it. And they recognized that all the way through, and they could not stray from Mao for that reason. Some of them did, and they were crushed. And they knew that would be all the way to the end. They had to they couldn't go beyond what Mao really wanted to do. And their power base in the factory, they probably were usually, some factories they were majority, most factories they were probably a minority. The party organization they had a much better organization than them. They had more long-standing organization, they had a hierarchy of authority, and this was a question also of the conservative faction. This was translated into the conservative factions. The party leaders were not able to directly lead the conservative factions. It had to be workers, but they benefited from all of the party organization in the factory. And so they were always, I think, stronger in many ways. And the rebels only were able to exercise power, like they took over factories after the seizure of power and during these battles. And they did when the more radical moments of the Cultural Revolution, but they could only do that as long as Mao said, this is what has to be done. The rebels have to be in power. And as soon as he withdrew that, they no longer had the power to maintain that. They had huge demonstrations. They could organize, mobilize hundreds of thousands of people, but they couldn't actually sustain their power in factories. I think I started to address this question of what was the difference between the rebels and the conservatives. The conservatives were largely just the old party organization, not made up of party members. There were party members, but lower level party members, but it was following the same kind of, in general, defending the status quo and following the leaders of the factory.
Okay, thank you. Next question is by Viren Murthy. Thank you, Joel, for this extremely informative talk. It seems that your book and talk is a story of the failure to create a situation where citizenship and autonomy mediate one another. However, the period from 1977 to 1992 appears to be an aberration that presented certain possibilities. You noted that people called this the golden age of the staff in Congress. Was this a period where citizenship and autonomy came together more? Might this be because increased autonomy did not completely unravel citizenship? Might it also be because of the importance of formalization?
Well, a formalization of I'll ask Viren, who's also an old friend who I haven't seen for many years. I'll ask, does he mean formalization of the Staff and Workers Congress or formalization of workers' employment relations?
Viren can't respond directly. Maybe he can take send
on the question and answer.
the Q&A function.
Let me start in any case. The 1980s, I think, I don't think it was a period when workers had more autonomy. The Cultural Revolution and some of these movements during the Mao era in 1957 and then 1966, 67, I think there was some kind of actual autonomy that some of these workers exercised, and particularly when they were organized in groups during the Cultural Revolution. It was not systematized, it was not institutionalized, and that was the problem, it never was. But I think during the 1980s, to the extent that people participated, and they did participate, and they had some influence because they participated, but it was completely under the tutelage of the party. The party, and one faction in the party, was in complete command. And so I think that there was not a lot of room for autonomy at that point, but there were more funds available for welfare, and workers were able to express themselves and make their needs known during that period more so than others. And also they still had power on the shop floor because they were still permanent employees. And they had these mechanisms through which to express themselves. But it wasn't a period of much autonomy.
Okay, we have, there's a response from Viren. I was referring to the formalization that Deng Xiaoping institutionalized.
These organizations. I don't think there was more formalization of the workers. I mean, the workers just as formal employees, and they're regular employees. They had been that since the 1950s. And they slowly, I mean, it started in 1984. They were less regularized in terms of employment regulations. They began with textile factories where it was largely women, and they started hiring temporary employees, contract workers. And that became more and more common then. So I don't think the 80s was a period of more formalization of labor. It was less gradually. And then completely opening the floodgates in the 1990s. Formalization of these institutions like the Staff and Workers Congress, yes. Before during the Mao era, the Staff and Workers Congress was, it was being built up and then it would get disrupted. Mao was not much for institutionalization of anything. And so when the movement arose, the Staff and Workers Congress was, the Cultural Revolution destroyed the Staff and Workers Congress along with the union that ran it. The party and union, basically the Staff and Workers Congress was part of the union organization, which was part of the party organization. And when Mao undermined the party organization, the union organization, that meant the end of the Staff and Workers Congress. It came back in 1973, but it was so much, the factors at that point were so, there were really places of dispassionate struggle between the radicals and the conservatives. And the fact that the Staff and Workers Congress was never really institutionalized during that period, although they were supposed to meet. They didn't really operate the way that they began to operate again, the way they operated in the early 60s, and then the way they began to operate again in the 1980s, or after 1978.
We have one more question, which I think it's a relatively short question, so I think we have time for that. Let me read it. It's anonymous, and the question is: many private companies in China are under family ownership. It does say whether this refers to contemporary times or to earlier times. Does this create a meaningful distinction for workplace autonomy, for example, through increased paternalism?
For example, what?
Through increased paternalism.
Paternalism, yeah. There were family enterprises, of course, before 1949 and into the 1950s. There were none during the rest of the Mao era. And during the 1980s, they really began again on a very, very small scale in the 1980s, and then larger and larger in the 1990s. Today, there's quite a few. I think that certainly they have more autonomy. They're no longer under central planning today. They do what they want. They're trying to maximize their revenues in the marketplace. And they have largely autonomy. They have to follow the law, and sometimes the Communist Party authorities intervene, but they largely operate autonomously. In terms of relations with workers, yes, some of them are paternalist. That's the kind of relationship that they've developed, but particularly if it's a kinship organization where they've invited a lot of kin to work. But I don't think workers have much power in these enterprises. They have very little power, and they're run by, sometimes very ruthlessly, by the families that own them.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to the end of this evening. Thanks, Joel. Thanks for a fantastic presentation and Q&A. Thanks also, Jake. And thanks to everybody in the audience and everybody who asked questions, and to Connie and Myra in the background. I have one last announcement that there is an upcoming talk next Tuesday by Judy Farquhar, Professor Farquhar, in anthropology here at Chicago. So it's in the chat or on the CS website. So once again, thank you and good night.
Let me thank you again for inviting me. I was delighted to come here, and thank you to you and to Jake for wonderful.
I guess we are the only ones. No, not even we can show you a yellow waving hand. So I just do this really manually. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks, Jake.